Good morning, church. Wherever you are this morning, wherever you have landed. I know some of you watch kind of sitting on your couch. Others of you are like me, kind of like that ability to roam around, move around a little bit. I spend a lot of my time when I'm watching a podcast or listening to a podcast or watching an interview or something, moving around because I don't sit still well. I know that's hard for you to believe, but I don't sit still well. What I wanted to talk to you about this morning as we get started, thank you, Pastor Tim, because I want you to hear this, is fishing buddies. Pastor Tim's a fisherman. I think most of you know that by now. But I want to talk about fishing buddies. My first fishing buddy was my dad, although I must say he wasn't a great fishing buddy because he was not very patient with his fishing buddies. You know, you had to figure out how you were doing this and not keep messing it up so that he could keep fishing. So there was a fishing buddy, but a fishing mentor, kind of not awesome. My second fishing buddy was a kid from down the street named Glenn. We used to go out. Neither of us knew what we were doing. He knew probably a little more than I. We used to go out to the local lakes where no one should ever eat the fish from a park lake, but we did. We would fish for bluegill and sunfish along the edges of the bank. And thought we were really something at 9, 10 years old when we would come home with a couple of fish. But that process of sitting along the bank with someone, of sharing that I don't know what it is. It's a discovery. It's a hunting process. It's an opportunity to be in nature with someone who's a friend and to learn and grow together. There's a lot of things tied up in this fishing buddy idea that I hadn't considered much until now. But I realized that Peter, James, John, and Andrew were not only fishing buddies together, they were Jesus fishing buddies. You might not think of that way, but they were Jesus fishing buddies. They met him, they involved themselves with him through fishing. He hung around with fishing with them quite a bit. He was probably out in their boats as much as they were after he became the leader of that band of the disciples. And they drew into that boat a lot of others. The boat stopped being so much a fishing vessel and became more often a transport vessel to get them across the lake from one place to another. But there was a lot of time spent with Jesus, the fisherman, on the lake. There was a lot of time spent around the fragrance of the water, the fragrance of fish from the bottom of that boat, nets that had been dried, probably hanging still in the houses of the disciples, probably still remnants of those things in the boat as they traveled from one place to another. There was this fishing theme, in fact, in the ministry of Jesus with these disciples. And I want to talk a little bit about that. But before I do, I want to move to the last disciple, the disciple who wasn't actually one of the fishing buddies. He came along too late to be a fishing buddy. He joined in the goal as a fisher of men, but he never was a part of the fishing gathering. He met these guys too late. But I want to really focus in on one thing he said. It's just as a launching point in Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. Paul writing to the Philippians, perhaps his favorite church. This is a church that would send him money as he traveled. They sent Epaphroditus to him. In fact, this book, Philippians, is written around that concept where he's writing them because he's sending Epaphroditus back. Epaphroditus had come to help him, gotten sick, and now Paul is sending him back. And he's kind of sending him this letter, a note saying, hey, he's done a good job. He's worked hard. Don't be upset by the fact that I've sent him back. He was awesome, and now he misses you, and he's been sick, so I'm sending him home. But the point in Philippians that I want to make is that Paul's very familiar with these people. He's very connected to these people, and they are starting to feel the persecution that he had felt in Philippi himself. Remember, this is where he and Silas end up in the jail. They end up singing, Paul and Silas famously singing in the Philippian jail. So they are now starting to experience some of that persecution, and he writes to them this letter. And there are lots of things that are said in it, but here's the piece I wanted you to catch. It's chapter 1, verse 6, and it says, he who began a good work in you, will see it through to the end. To the end. I hope, Tim, you appreciate that there are fish on these slides. so that you can just be connected to the whole idea. But he who began a good work in you will see it through to the end. It's interesting that Paul writes this at this point in his life. It's between 63 and 64 AD. Paul is in a Roman prison as he writes this message. He is actually in the process with Jesus. He's not arrived at the end. He is stating this by faith. He who began a good work in you will see it through to the end. He's sending his faith on to the Philippians, saying, Philippian folk, my friends, he who started a good work in you will stick with you all the way to the end. He will walk with you all the way till you get home. We talk about that a lot here, but here's Paul sort of shaping it for us in a sentence. He who began in the beginning with you, he who started the mission with you, will walk with you all the way to the end of it. He who began with you will end with you, and he will walk with you all the way through. He who began a good work in you will see it through to the end. So now I want to jump to those fishing buddies and start in Luke chapter 5, where they were just beginning this process to begin to learn to trust in him a little more. So in Luke chapter 5, I have to grab my Bible here. I got so caught up thinking about fishing buddies that I forgot that I was holding a Bible here, or needing to grab my Bible here. So it's Luke chapter 5. I'm going to begin in verse 1. And it says, so it was, as the multitude pressed about him. They're in Galilee. The multitude is the crowds that are regularly gathering around him is Jesus. As the multitudes pressed about him, to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, Sea of Galilee, Lake of Gennesaret, sometimes called the Sea of Tiberias, all the same place, and saw two boats standing by the lake. But the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. You know, when the nets get little bits of junk in them, you have to keep them clean, or they begin to degrade. It's a good metaphor for receiving the blessings of God. Keep the crud cleared out, and your net will be able to withstand the blessings God is sending you. Verse 3, then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's boat, and asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. I just want you to imagine for a second that Jesus is crowded by so much. People are pushing in and pushing in and pushing in on him, that he's now at the edge of the lake. He's stuck at the edge of the lake. The crowds are pushing. There's nowhere for him to go. He says to Peter, hey, can I use your boat? He gets in the boat, has him push out a little bit from the shore, and from the safety of the water, he continues to teach. The crowd was pressing him so much that he was starting to get at the edge of where he could go. Now in the fishing boat, he could push out a little way from shore, and people weren't going to push him into the water. He was able then to minister to them. So he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. We don't get anything on the sermon. We get no information about what was said. There's no statement about what he's talking about. This is the silent sermon. We get nothing here, just that a giant group of people were there to hear this sermon. And it simply says, when he had stopped speaking. So he starts the sermon, and we go right to the end of the sermon. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. So he borrowed the boat. Now he says, okay, push the boat out into the deeper water and drop your nets. Drop your nets down. It's probably mid-morning to midday, sometime in there as this happens, because they're still washing their nets from the night before, so it's probably not evening. They would have finished that task and gone home if it were. So it's probably mid-morning to midday at the latest when Jesus finishes. Not fishing time on the lake. The lake's too clear. You throw your net out on this clear lake, and the fish scatter, so they normally would fish at night, so the fish can't see the net coming. Simon answers him, verse 5. Master, we've toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I'll let down the nets. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the nets. It's an interesting statement because Peter's extending some trust, extending some faith. I'll do it because you said to do it. Verse 6. When they had done this, they caught a great number of fish. Their net was breaking. So the they there has to be Peter and Jesus, or Peter, Andrew, and Jesus. Remember, Peter and Andrew are fishing partners in the boat, in the family business. The they being included here is either just Peter and Andrew, or it's Peter, Andrew, and Jesus in the boat. And they try to haul in the nets. The nets are so full that they begin to break. Verse 7. I want to pause on verse 7 for a second. So they signaled to their partners in their boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. Now I'll pick it up right there for a sec in a minute, but I just wanted to stop there and recognize that they signaled to their partners because there was so many fish. There were so many fish in the boat that they had to signal to their partners, so many fish to get into the boat, they had to signal to their partners. What I wanted to say about it is this: some blessings have to be shared in order to be contained. Some blessings have to be shared in order to be contained. Some blessings have to be shared in order to be contained. In order for this big, giant blessing that they were given to be gathered in, it had to be shared. They had to spread it to their friends, to their partners, to James and John. So now we have Peter, Andrew, Jesus, James, and John in this fishing experience, fishing buddies. They're dragging in this net. It's so full of fish that the Bible actually says their boats began to sink. Some of you have experienced boat sinking blessings before. Some of you have. Some of you have been blessed by God in such an overwhelming way that you've experienced what it feels to have such a full experience of God's abundance that the boat begins to sink, that the current container is not adaptable to the amount of the blessing, and you need a new container. The current container is not adaptable to the amount of the blessing, and so you need a new container. This empty building that we're dealing with right now was our answer to a blessing too big to be contained. This building is our answer to a blessing too big to be contained by the old building. God was continuing to grow and continuing to bless our church, and so we needed to find a way to expand that opportunity. We needed to find a way to expand the container so that we could hold the blessing of God. We look forward to the day when we will be able to see that with our own eyes, but we see it by faith right now, and we see it in the experiences of the disciples. But I want you to remind you of this. Some blessings need to be shared in order to be contained, because the hoarding of the blessings of God causes them to spoil. The hoarding of the blessings of God causes them to spoil. The most famous one of these is when God was giving the people of Israel manna, right? He's giving them manna daily. Manna comes every day. God says, take enough for that day. And then the Bible says that if somebody went out and gathered a lot, turned out to be just enough for the day. If somebody gathered just a little, turned out to be just enough for the day. And if somebody tried to put it in a Ziploc bag and keep it overnight, that night it would rot, stink, and get maggots in one night, except for Sabbath when it would last for 48 hours. This one time was the only exception because God was blessing it specifically for that time. But it is a great example of what I mean. The hoarding of the blessings of God turns them into a curse. The hoarding of the blessings of God causes them to spoil. You have to use it or you lose it. Have you ever heard about that with people who sing? People who sing, who are good at it, who are blessed by it, who have this wonderful voice, if they stop singing, their voice begins to deteriorate. The best way to maintain the voice that God has blessed you with is to share it. Same thing is true if you play an instrument. Same thing is true if you have a gift in some other area. If you're going to maintain your skills, if you are an excellent carpenter and you stop, you have a head full of things, but your hands aren't used to doing them, and you begin to weaken in your skill. When God blesses you with something, when God pours out his blessing into you, if you don't share it, it will begin to spoil. It will begin to degrade. If you hoard it, it has the opportunity to actually take over your life and destroy your faith. This is the case of what happens with people who have been blessed, especially materially. People who have been blessed with a great deal of material gain. If they hoard it, it will often begin to deteriorate their faith. If they share it, that blessing spreads and gives opportunity for it to grow. Remember that when God was talking about tithing, he says, test me in this. Test me in giving away 10%. And see if I will not open up the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that you cannot contain. He says, if you will give me 10% in faith, if you will trust me and give away this part, it will make room for a bigger blessing from me. So their ship, their boat is beginning to fill up. They call their partners come, they pull the two boats in next to each other because it's only one net. They start pulling out the net, and as the net is being pulled in and they're trying to keep from breaking the net, the boats are both being filled to the gunnels. Gunnels are those edges, the edges that are out of the water, filled to the gunnels, and fish are now flopping back into the water, and as this giant horde of fish is there, they're slowly having to make their way to the shore. They are being blessed beyond their capability to contain it. When they had done this, they caught a great number of fish. Skipping down to verse 8, when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me, for I am a sinful Lord, I am a sinful man. Depart from me, for I am a sinful man. Now, I don't know if your images are like mine, but I picture this guy in a boat full of fish trying to find a place to kneel in front of Jesus. His boat is so full of fish that it's overwhelmed. It's beginning to sit so low in the water that they're fearful that the water will actually come into the boat and the boat will sink. And here's Peter, in the midst of all of that, trying to find a place to fall in front of Jesus. Has he fallen down on top of the fish? Has he found a spot where he can fall down while Jesus is still trying to help pull in the nets? But it is so important to Peter to recognize that this gift is from God, that right in the middle of receiving the blessing, he falls on his knees to thank God. Not a bad practice. Not a bad practice. When you realize that you're in the midst of receiving a blessing, to in that moment thank God for it. It sets the course. It sets a concept. It sets a conversion in your heart and mind that the blessing you've just received isn't yours. That the blessing you received came from him, is being contained with you for a little while just to be passed on. We don't know what happens to this boatload of fish. You know, the Bible never says they went to market and they made a bunch of money and they cornered the fishing market in the area. They dried what they could. They sold what they could. No, it doesn't tell you. Doesn't tell you. It's interesting to me, though, that these two families give up the two breadwinners in each family. Peter and Andrew, their family, these guys are the breadwinners. James and John, they're part of a fishing business that their father has several boats, but they're primary in it. These two families give up primary breadwinners, and as they give those things up and head out on the road with Jesus, Jesus blesses them with a catch that will carry them through the hardship that will fall on their family. God takes care of us. Jesus' next comment to them is a little weird. First of all, he says, do not be afraid. Apparently, Simon is freaked out by this. He's not just doing it and worshiping Jesus and all. He's apparently shaken, just nervous about what he's just experienced. And as he is, Jesus says, don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. From now on, you're going to be a fisher of men. So you just finished gathering in this big haul of fish, probably the best one you've ever caught. We're dragging to shore. We're rowing the boats in. We've got fish in the boat. We've got fish in the other boat. We've got fish still in the net. We're rowing the whole thing into shore. Peter pauses to praise, and Jesus says, well, don't be afraid. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And when Peter experiences this massive haul of fish, he realizes that he is not in the presence of a man, that he is in the presence of God. And he is so stunned that it stops him in the middle of it. And he falls on his knees. And there in front of Jesus with some sort of trembling that makes Jesus know that he's scared. He says, I'm not worthy to be blessed like this. Jesus' answer could have been, no one is. Because no one is. He says to him, don't be afraid. Don't let this scare you. Don't let the obvious miracle you've just experienced frighten you. Don't worry. Don't be afraid. I'm going to make you a fisher of men. From now on, it's not going to be about fish. It's going to be about being a fisher of men. So what happens? How do you become a fisher of men? How does this next phase happen? These guys who are Jesus' fishing buddies, or Jesus is their fishing buddy, how does this business work? How does it pan out over the next 3 years? What is Jesus doing with them? Well, I think there are 3 things that I could call to your attention. There are lots, but I just want to call these 3. First, they're learning to fish by faith. This throw your net on the other side of the boat, this throw your net in the deeper water, this idea that you're just going to do what I tell you with your net, that's fishing by faith. Now, I don't know if you're a fisherman, if you get to do this, if you've ever had a fishing buddy, but I'll tell you what's great about fishing buddies. Fishing buddies tell you where their favorite place is. Fishing buddies take you to their favorite place. I had a church member in a previous church who was a huge steelhead and salmon fisherman. He caught them. Other people fished for them. He caught them. He had this amazing tactical dexterity, tactile dexterity. He could feel the slightest touch from a fish. And I remember going fishing with him, and he took me out in the boondocks. It was just way out on a river, and we were fishing for salmon. And we had gone out on this river, and this river was fairly populated with fish, with fishermen and fish. And we get to this place where a creek is coming into the main flow of the river, and there's a lot of folks gathered along the bank. In fact, if it were me, I would have never stopped there, because I'm looking at it thinking, wow, this is like being fished by 40 other people. Why would you want to drop a line in there? But he wanted to stop by there. It was on the way to his regular, normal favorite fishing hole, and it was one of his favorites. And he said, let's stop here. And so we did. We went down below. He told me how to get my line in the water. I got my line in the water, and I was standing next to him. He's to my left. I'm standing there with a line in the water, not knowing what I'm doing or what I'm feeling on the line. I'm just a rookie at the time. Still am, basically. But all of a sudden, it's probably not been 2 minutes in the water, he yells to everybody on the bank, fish on, and he starts reeling in this fish. And sure enough, he's got a fish on, and these big salmon, they don't just come directly to shore. They're trying to get away, so this fish is swimming up and down the shore. And as the fish goes to the right, everybody on his right has to reel in their line and get it out of the water. As the fish goes back to the left, everybody has to reel in their line and let this fish travel back and forth freely in the midst of this mess. And so these guys who are on the sides of us are not happy with him. He lands the fish, lets it go back in the water, throws his line out again. He's not in, and I promise this is the truth. He's not in the water another 5 minutes, and he yells, fish on again. No one else has yelled fish on. We've been there maybe 10 minutes, and he's already number 2 in, and he's doing the same thing. He's chasing everybody off the bank as the fish runs back and forth up and down the bank. And I'm just flabbergasted. I'm basically just holding a fishing pole at this point. By the way, so is everybody else on the bank. You see, he was a gifted fisherman. And he was trying to show me how to do it. And as he was impacted by this, as he was catching fish, it disturbed a lot of other people. He had taken me to one of his favorite spots. It was the favorite spot of a lot of other folks. And as he was catching fish, it was disturbing other people. It's a funny thing, when the blessing of God flows your way, sometimes it disturbs the people around you because jealousy, frustration, interference. After the second fish, he said, we better go because people were getting angry. And we went up to his favorite fishing hole. It was quiet. It was just a few of us there. And then he started teaching me to fish. You see, what Jesus does with the disciples is he begins to teach them how to fish for men. how to fish by faith for people. They watch him as he talks to people, the way he treats people. They watch the kindness. They watch the love. They watch the overflow of his desire to serve and bless people. They watch the miracles. They watch as a leper is cleansed. They watch as a woman's son is raised from the dead. They watch demon-possessed people who are cleansed of their demons and healed. They watch people who couldn't walk. They watch people who couldn't talk. They watch people who couldn't see. And as they watch all of these things, their faith in Jesus' abilities grows. And they begin to really trust and understand that he has this covered. But what he's showing them is how to fish for men. He's showing them how to build relationships, to see their needs and meet their needs, and to build relationships of trust so that they'll be willing to talk to you about something as significant and as personal as faith. He's also teaching them to learn to fish in their own pond. This is the first rule of fishing that most people never really learn. You have to fish in familiar waters. You have to learn to fish in familiar waters. When Glenn and I were going to the local lake, it was bicycle riding distance from our house, and we knew the lake. We knew where the fish tended to gather in the mornings and the afternoons. We knew that if we fished among the reeds on certain parts of the lake, there would be sunfish there. There would be bluegill there. We could always find fish because we knew the lake. We had gotten accustomed to it. If you're going to become a good fisherman, you have to learn to fish in your own pond. This is true if you are a fisher of men too. Jesus took the disciples first in Galilee and let them learn how to fish in that pond. Then he took them down to Judah and he let them learn how to fish in that pond. And they began to realize what it was like to win their fellow Israelites to God. They began to see what it was like to testify to them. They began to see that the Pharisees would resist, that there would be people who would be frustrated when they were fishing. They began to see that God would bless and God would do things that they would not able to do. He sent them out 2 by 2 to go fishing. He said, you guys go and do these things. And they found that they were able, in his name, to be a blessing themselves to a bunch of other people. And that they could multiply the lines in the water and therefore multiply the return of the fish. You see, that's what the church has been all along. It's just been a giant fishing party, and God has been saying, multiply the lines in the water, multiply the lines in the water, multiply the lines in the water. Keep building relationship, keep meeting people's needs, keep trusting, keep building trust so that you can speak for me. Keep building relationships, keep meeting people's needs, keep building trust so that you can speak for me, because nobody wants to speak to a stranger about something as personal as a relationship with God. And yet that's what most people try to do. They try to dive into other people's ponds and fish. And when you just wander onto somebody else's land, drop a line in their pond, they're not happy with you. Jesus taught them to fish in their own pond, to learn how to fish in a place where they were aware. And he taught them to share the catch. He taught them to share the faith, to spread the blessing, to give that blessing away to people who may not even be appreciative of it. He gave 10 lepers healing and 1 leper returned. 9 lepers still were healed, and the 1 leper got the full blessing of not only being healed, but being in relationship with the healer. Some people received the blessing without returning to the healer, without interest in the healer at all, without discovering Jesus. They're blessed by his family. They're blessed by you. They're blessed to live next door to you. They're blessed to be a part of your family. They're blessed to be under the influence that you are under, because Jesus blesses you, you bless them. And then those same people, they're just not interested in Jesus. And they had to learn to be okay, to keep sharing and keep sharing and keep sharing even when there wasn't a response. See, that's what they did for 3 years. They wandered around with Jesus, and they saw some fish stories. They saw some amazing fish stories. They saw Jesus take a little boy's lunch, just some bread and some fish, and multiply it for 5,000 people. They saw him shortly later, it's not long after that one, where he does the same thing. He takes bread and fish, and he multiplies it for 4,000 people. These are the men. So you're probably talking closer to 10, 15, or 20,000 people were fed by Jesus with the disciples. And they had a hand in it. They literally had a physical part in it. Jesus was handing bread to them. They were handing it to the people. He was handing it to them. They were handing it to the people. He was handing it to, and the blessing kept flowing. And the fish kept being shared, and the bread kept being shared, and the blessing kept flowing until everyone had enough. And do you realize that at the end of that story, it doesn't say, and Jesus baptized 30,000 people that day? In fact, the Bible doesn't say anything about the receivers of the blessing. It seems that they ate and they went home. And the only thing noted in the feeding of the 5,000 afterwards and the feeding of the 4,000 is the leftovers. That after God had fed all of these people, that there was still enough blessing left to take away and feed somebody else. There were some amazing fish stories. It's interesting because there are 4 major stories in the Bible that center around fishing. The first one is Luke 5. The second one is the feeding of the 5,000. The third one is the feeding of the 4,000. The fourth one is the one I want to end on today. It's in John chapter 21. In John chapter 21, you have the story of Jesus meeting the disciples, probably the last time they see him, before Acts chapter 1. Jesus meeting the disciples up in Galilee. We don't know why they've gone back to Galilee. It was one point when he told them that he would meet them in Galilee, but that seems to have already happened. This looks like it's the last time they're together. Jesus is up in Galilee. The disciples are up in Galilee. Here's what the story says. It says that Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and a couple of others. I don't know why when John writes this about 60 years later, he doesn't remember who the other 2 guys are, but you've probably done that. You've probably done that. Where you couldn't remember who were those other people. I don't remember. There were two more, but I don't remember who that was. There were only 12 disciples. You'd think he'd figure it out, but by then he's lost it. But he knows it's Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, Thomas the twin, by the way, Nathanael, who's also from Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, James and John. So we're back with the group that started. We're getting the band back together. We're back to the guys who fish the lake all the time. And Simon Peter has all these people with him up there in the Sea of Galilee, Sea of Tiberias. And he says, I'm going fishing. We don't know why. I do know that it's very easy for me to want to go back to what is comfortable. To go back to situations that I'm comfortable in, that I feel like I have control over. To go back to the familiar. And this would be familiar to him. It would be familiar to James and John. This concept, this idea of going back to fishing, going back to living in Galilee, going back to being around people who spoke like you, who had your accent, being back in the midst of people you were comfortable with. I remember coming from France to England. We'd been in places where English was not the primary language for a week or two. And I remember how glad I was to get on a ferry to cross the English Channel and to hear the guy on the loudspeaker in the boat say something I understood. To hear just English being spoken was so nice. It just was like, oh man, that's great. It's English. I know what's being announced. And I just remember feeling, oh man, that familiar language that I understand. How cool is that? How nice is that? And this is what's happening, I think. Peter and at least James and John and probably Nathanael are all going back to where things are familiar. They're away from the hustle and bustle of Jerusalem. They're away from the persecution that has already begun. They're away from the fear of being down there. And now they've gone home, and they're in their home base. And Peter's sitting in his house one afternoon, and he says, you know what I want to do tonight? I want to go fishing. And the guys say, hey, yeah, that'd be great. Let's go fishing. And there's a moment when going back to what is familiar is deadly. That it will drag you away from your calling when you go back to what's familiar. Because God has called you out of something into something else. He called them to be fishers of men, and Peter wants to go back to being fisher of fish. At least that's what it appears to be. And here they are on this last fishing trip. And this typical thing seems to happen to these guys. They fish all night. Morning had now come. Jesus stood on the shore, and Jesus said to them, have you any fish to eat? I like one of the translations says, fellas, did you catch enough fish to eat? No one wants to hear that when they haven't caught fish. They answered him, No! It's a shouting of 100 yards. So there's voices are raised in order to be heard, even across the flat plain of the water. And he said to them, cast your nets on the other side of the boat. Cast your nets on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. Now, I've heard scholars say that sometimes a person on the shore could see a shoal of fish gathering when a person in the boat couldn't see them. I don't know how that would work, because these nets were not thrown a great distance. They were literally thrown over the side of the boat. When we last took a group of people to Israel, the guy who was taking us out on the Sea of Galilee actually threw a net out. Threw the net out just to demonstrate how fishing had been done on the lake. And he tossed this net out. It's got some weights on it, and it's got some lines on it so that it begins to sink, and you draw it in from the ropes, and it closes the net around the fish. And so I don't know how that would be true if that he could see what they couldn't see. It's possible, I suppose. The sun's coming up. It could be causing reflections on the water. But he says, cast the net on the right side of the boat. And when they cast the nets over there, when they did what he said, when they obeyed as they had before, they cast the nets, and they were so full they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved, you know who that is? When John is writing, he's referring to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Remember, he's that disciple who leaned on Jesus' shoulder at the Last Supper. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, what is the therefore? Because he is saying, because the net was full, because there was a great haul of fish, therefore, as a result of this giant load of fish they were now trying to drag into the boat, as a result of feeling this heavy tug and this hard pull to get the fish on board, as a result of that, John says, it's the Lord. If you follow the story, if you read this part of the Bible before, you know Peter, the impulsive guy that he is, throws on some clothes because he's pretty much stripped down to his boxers to do the work that they're going to do. He throws on some clothes and dives in the water. I would have thought, jump in the water in your boxers, get your clothes dry when you get to shore, but that's not his thinking. He's a little impulsive, throws on some clothes, dives in the water, swims to shore. Leaves the guys in the boat to deal with the fish. This giant haul of fish, fishing was his idea. Now he's abandoned the idea of fishing because he's been reminded who's on shore. Sometimes all we need to get back on our call is a reminder of who's on shore, a reminder of the being we're following, the reminder that it's Jesus who called us. If you are straying from your call, if you're wandering off, struggling to stay focused on what God has called you to do, you're thinking about going back to the familiar, maybe you already have gone back to the familiar. If you're thinking about wandering off, I worry about those of you who have volunteered to be part of church and volunteered for ministry that you love and you care about, and you haven't been able to perform it in a long time, and you may be thinking, well, I'm not going to ever do that because what am I doing? I haven't done anything in almost a year now. Hang on. There will be a time when the voice of Jesus shouts out across the water to you too, throw the net on the other side of the boat, and calls you back to work. Peter hears the voice of Jesus, affirmed by John, and he dives in the water and heads to shore, swimming as he goes, leaving the others to continue the work that he had started. As soon as they had come to land, they see a strange thing. And this is part of what set me off here in this walk with you today. When they get to shore, they find out Jesus already has fish. When they get to shore, the Bible says as soon as they came to land, they saw fire, coals, and fish, and bread. Now, he's at the lake. Fish makes sense. Where did he get the bread? He didn't have a little boy delivered to him. He didn't have some disciples to start with. He didn't have a lunch to start with at all. He just apparently can make bread without multiplying it. He can just make bread and fish from nothing. Just by the power of the Word, just through the power of the creatorship of God, he's able to make something from nothing. And there on the coals are some fish. And there's some bread. As the disciples land with a load of fish, they realize Jesus already has fish. You know, Jesus doesn't need us. Not really. But we need to fish. God can do what God needs to do to move the world. But we need to be engaged because it is ours to learn, to trust the one who is our fishing buddy, to trust that he knows what he's doing, to trust that his call is real, to trust and to grow and to see the miracles that only he can provide when we are walking in the path that he's trying to lead us on. He already had fish. It's very interesting, though, because for whatever reason, he apparently doesn't have enough fish. Jesus has miraculously gotten fish and bread to feed these guys who are, by the way, apparently moving in the wrong direction away from their call. He's still going to feed them. He's so good to us. But then he says to them, bring some of the fish which you've just caught. He said, guys, I've done this. Here it is. They got to the shore and they see, well, he's already got fish. What was do you guys have any fish to eat? Question. That was just an excuse to get him to throw the net back in the water, to get him to try again. When they get to shore, Jesus, listen, calls them to partnership. When they get back to shore, Jesus calls them to partner with him in breakfast. When they get back to shore, it's a partnership. Prior to this, they had always watched Jesus do cool things, except for that one excursion out by twos. They'd always been the deacons in the partnership. He's made them the elders. He said, take some of that fish you caught, add it to the fire. So somebody's grabbing fish and cleaning fish and getting fish ready to go on the fire, and the breakfast starts. The Bible tells us nobody questioned who he was because they all knew who he was now. By the fact that they had dragged in a full net, by the fact that they had now had bread and fish miraculously provided, I guess they would know who he was now. Apparently Jesus doesn't look the same in his transformed nature as he looked in his human broken nature, and I wouldn't and shouldn't be surprised by that. This last fishing trip, the Bible then has this very interesting, so familiar phrase. Jesus then took the bread. Jesus took the bread, broke it, and gave it to them. It's almost like communion. It's almost like that morning, that evening when he sits down with the two men who had been walking along with him with their hearts burning in them, and he takes the bread and he blesses it, and the two of them say, wow, that's Jesus, as he disappears. He takes the bread and he breaks it, and they had to see the feeding of the 5,000. They had to see the feeding of the 4,000, and he hands it out like he did before. Only there's no one to give it to right now. It's just for them. And he takes the fish and he does the same thing with it. You see, he who began a good work in you will see it through to the end, but he doesn't stop in between helping you. He who began a good work with these guys and had trained them for 3 years wasn't abandoning them to go back to heaven. He was going to consistently and continuously interact with them and help them. The one who began a good work in you will see it through to the end by walking with you through the steps necessary for you to arrive at the end. He who began a good work in you will see it through to the end by walking the steps necessary with you to see that you make it to the end. In this last fishing trip, Peter gets taken off by himself. We spend a lot of time talking about Peter. I just want to bring it home. I just want to land it here. because there was another lesson of the day. One lesson was, I've called you to be fishers of men. I can provide fish. I need evangelists. I want you to go out and build relationships with people, care about them, meet their needs, love them, and bless them so that you can talk to them about me. Still the work of the church. But all along, Jesus had been the shepherd. He had said to them, I am the good shepherd. I'm the door to the sheepfold. I'm the one whose sheep hear and know who they're following. But Jesus was leaving, and so he takes Peter aside. And 3 times he asks Peter if he loves him, because that's the only qualification for being a shepherd of God's people, by the way. And number 2, he reminds him to feed them. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my lambs. When we get to the book of 1 Peter, when he's writing a book himself, when he's finally putting pen to paper and telling the church what he wants to say to them before he dies himself, he's already reached a moment when he knows life is about to end for him. He's already aware that he won't survive much longer. He's already aware that he's probably going to die soon. In the midst of that letter, he brings to them the words of Jesus. Now may I, who am myself an elder, say a word to you, my fellow elders. He's talking to the leaders of the church. He's talking to the people who have been called to care for the church. There are always going to be people whose ministry is to care for the believers, to feed and care for the sheep. All of us are called to be evangelists. Not all of us are called to be pastors, but all of us are called to do outreach and touch our neighbors, even the pastors. But the pastors, the elders, are called to also care about and care for the sheep. And he says, I am a fellow elder with you. I speak as one who actually saw Christ. More importantly, he says, I actually saw Christ suffer. And as one who will share with you the glories that are to be unfolded to us. I speak as one who saw Christ suffer and as one who will be in heaven with you. I urge you to see that your flock of God, your people, your church, the people who you've been given to take care of, is properly fed and cared for. You see, there was a lot being taught that day. They caught a lot of fish, 153. You can look that up and figure out why that's important. 153 big fish. As they dragged the net to shore, they realized that Jesus already had fish and bread. He didn't need them to provide breakfast. But he asks them to partner with him in feeding. Bring some of your own fish. We'll share this. And he specifically calls out Peter, who will be the first of the shepherds, the larger group of shepherds that the disciples will all become. And he leaves these 2 groups called to be evangelists, called to fish for men, to fish for people who have yet to find Jesus, to build relationships with them, to meet their needs, to be unselfishly willing to help and bless them without expectation that they will do anything other than receive it. To build trust so that when the opportunity arises, you can speak for Jesus. And to learn to do it in your own pond. See, Jesus had taught them how to fish in their own pond, but he was launching them out to sea. And then he said, oh, by the way, when you catch these fish, when you have a whole bunch of them. When the flock has grown, and he switches metaphors to sheep, then make sure that they're cared for. So I speak to you today in the same voice. He who began a good work in you would like to see it through to the end. He'd like you to join the work. Let's pray. Father God, we are aware of our unfitness. We are aware that we don't actually know how we are supposed to do this. We are aware that fishing is not our skill. Fishing for men is just bizarre to us even. But we know that you are capable of making us into fishers of men. And that you won't abandon us in that process either. You began a good work in us. You will see to it that we make it to the end. You will care for us and watch over us and help us and lead us and forgive us and change us and direct us and forgive us and call us and lead us and change us and direct us and forgive us. And you'll take us all the way through to the end, different than we are today. But we are all acutely aware that you've called us to join you. Lord, teach us how to love our neighbor. So much so that we can't bear the idea of them missing the opportunity to go to heaven. And teach us to love you so dearly that we see our call to feed your sheep. Thank you for your grace, for our failings, for your power in our weakness. And the reality that you see more in us than we see in ourselves. In your name we pray. Amen.